everyone and welcome to the first video I've ever done on map making. My name's Josh and today I'm going to be doing a small rundown of how I detail an often forgotten about feature in maps, continental shelves. Now, if you're just starting out in map making and have no idea what I just said, think of it this way. You know those pictures and videos of divers swimming out over a sudden abyss? That thing? Yeah, that's a continental shelf. It's where the actual continents we live on are submerged beneath water, often for miles and miles before dropping off into the deeper ocean. So, why are these important? Do I need to have them on my map? Strictly speaking, it depends on your aesthetic preference, especially in fantasy maps. You absolutely do not have to use them, but they do tell part of the world's story. Continental shelves not only manipulate currents, which in turn count towards your climates, but most importantly, they can show the motion of your landmasses. Look at South America, for example. You can almost see the dragging of the shelf where the continent has separated from the west coast of Africa. Anyway, lesson over. Let's get to work. So, where do we begin? Well, first of all, you've got to decide what sort of shape your continental shelf is going to be. So this is an example map I'm using. This is actually my own personal project, and this grey area just represents the landmass, which I haven't detailed out yet. But I always start on the ocean just because, you know, it gives me a nice base to work the land off. So I'm going to be focusing on this area for this tutorial. The full size of this map is quite large, as you can see. We're only focusing in this small area. So yeah, just for this tutorial we'll work on this area. So the first thing I'm going to do is just going to ignore all of this because this is the work I've done already, and you probably won't have got to this stage yet. So we've got our land, which is just this top layer here, and we've got our ocean colour down here, and this is sampled from the swatches I provided on my Patreon. You can get these too, but you can also just sample this from the real world. Just look up maps of Earth and sample colours from the ocean, as simple as that. So the first step is to make a new layer. I'm going to sample this colour from my swatches here, and I'll turn that to the foreground colour. And now I'm going to fill this layer, this entire layer, with that colour. So I can do that by hitting Alt Backspace. If you're on PC, it should be Command Backspace on a Mac, I'm not sure. It's been a while since I've used it. But as you can see, this whole layer is now filled with this colour. So how is this helpful? Well, this gives us basically all the room to play with, and then we can chip away from that as we will. But what I'm going to do, first of all, go down to this toolbar right at the bottom right of Photoshop. And I'm going to hit this button, which is Layer Mask. And that's going to add a layer mask. If you've never used a layer mask before, basically it's just a fancy eraser tool. All it does is we alt click on this white. It shows us anything that's white will be visible, anything that's black will be invisible, and all the shades of grey in between. You get it. So we're going to use this layer mask to erase parts of this. Conversely, what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to invert the layer mask so everything is invisible. Now, how do I do that? So with the layer mask selected, make sure this little box is around the layer mask, not this part, because this is the actual layer. We want that to stay unchanged. We want to work only in the layer mask. So I'm going to click on the layer mask, and I'm going to hit Control or Command I, which inverts it, which brings us back to the old colour, which is actually just the layer beneath it. So with that in mind, we're just going to draw out the shape that we want to use for our continental shelf. And just because I'm only doing this part of the map for this tutorial, I'm just going to simply use the lasso tool, which is here. I'm going to get the freeform lasso just because it's a bit smoother. I'm just going to drag general shape. And I reckon we're going to go for this sort of thing. So we've got some deep areas and a huge shallow area in that bay. I really should close my swatches window because I can't see what I'm doing. I'm just going to go all the way around. I'm just going to go to there. So now we have a selection. Now, what do we do with this? Well, we want to fill that with white in this layer mask so that only this area of that layer mask is visible. With that selected, with the layer mask clicked on, I'm just going to hit Control or Command I again, and then Control or Command D to deselect. Okay, so this is the general gist of your continental shelf. This is sort of like a guideline of where you're going to put things. So I know that this area is going to be fairly deep around these islands, and then this area is going to be very shallow, but obviously this isn't going to be flat. There's going to be some varying depths in here, slowly getting deeper towards this part, and maybe we'll have a very smooth transition into the ocean floor. Before we can do all that, what we need to do is add a layer effect to this layer so that it actually looks 3D. So this is where the magic comes in. What we're going to do is, just to remind ourselves where we are, we're going to double click on this layer here to rename it. I'm just going to call this shelf, and then double click in the space here on the same layer, so not on the name, not on the thumbnails, double click on the space in the layer. This will bring up our layer style menu. Now by default you'll normally have a lot more options than this. This is only here because I've used different presets recently. So if you come up with this and that's it, or even less, just go to styles, basics, and then select this first one with the red line through it, and that will reset your menu. Okay, awesome. What do we do with this? Well, the idea of this is to give it some sort of lighting and bevel effect. So in a sense this will do most of the work for you, and then you can start chopping into this layer and everything will come together really nicely. So what style are we going to use here? The first thing we're going to check is bevel and emboss. And you might notice here it's given it a slight edge. That usually is very small at the start. You might not notice much of a difference. It may be different on your system though, we don't know. With that selected, I'm going to click on this, which will open a sub menu. And where it says inner bevel, we're just going to leave it to that because we want it to cut in to the layer we've got visible, not be affected on the outside. And on the technique setting, we're going to change this to chisel soft, which will give it a bit of a gnarlier edge, and this will help when we start using brushes later to define this. We want the direction to be up, and out the depth setting, this is completely up to you. It's all down to your preference at the end of the day, but I set mine somewhere around 900 just because it's really stark then and we get some nice shadows. On size, I'm going to leave this around 7 or 8. Soften, you can change this if you want, but this will kind of ruin the details you put in. But if you want the sort of blurred effect where the focus is entirely on the land, you can change soften to sort of give this a bit more of a blurry look to it, but I leave that at 0. Now, we're going to go to the angle of the shading here, and you might be set to 90 degrees by default, but I've set mine to stay at 135, which is what you typically see lighting on a map. So the sunlight is coming from this direction, 135 degrees, and the altitude is 30. You can keep use global light on because this means if you apply any more layers, they'll all use this setting. So the gloss contour I'm leaving as default. Then the highlight mode I'm going to put to normal. As a matter of fact, we don't even need highlights because you don't tend to see very harsh highlights underwater simply because of diffraction and diffusion. You're not going to see anything being highlighted, but you will see shadows. So I'm going to put this to normal and this setting to 100%. So this is your shadows, and now you can see there's a really dark line. Now we don't want that black because you won't see black underwater, but you will see very deep blue. I'm going to click on this thumbnail here, which will open color picker, and you could experiment in here and choose any color you like. Maybe you're doing an alien planet and your watercolor is different, but I have a particular hex code that I'm going to use, so if you want to use the same, it is 1B23 4D. That's a sort of mid to dark blue. Yeah, click OK. And now what this does, if I take it off, put it back, it means that anything on the opposite side of the light is going to have this shadow, but we're not going to have any harsh highlights either. And for now, that's all we need to do, so I'm going to click OK. What will normally happen now is once you come out of layer styles, the default setting will be to come back to your layer here, and this is where a lot of people get tricked. They'll start trying to work on shaping their shelf and nothing will happen because they're working on the actual layer, not the mask. So just make sure you've clicked on your mask again And now I think we're about ready to work. I'm going to hit B on my keyboard for brush. And now I'm going to use a variety of different brushes to edit this. Now, the best thing to do first of all is to start texturing your Continental shelf before you start chipping away at the edges. But it just makes it a bit easier later on. So how am I going to do this? Well, first of all, I'm going to right click to bring up my brush menu. Do it up here so we've got a bit more room to play with. Now I've got a lot of brushes loaded, so you can virtually use any brush you own to texture this, because we're only going to be doing slight adjustments over time to make a larger effect. So what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to use one of my brushes that I've made, Terrain 6. Click out of this, and by default this is a very large brush, so you can see here it's enormous. So I'm just going to use the left square bracket key on the keyboard to bring this down a bit. Now, this isn't enough just to do this. We have to actually change the brush settings to make sure that we're getting randomized stamps of this effect, so that we don't just have, you know, this happening. And you know, that doesn't look too bad on its own on one of them, but this is going to get too uniform, and humans are very good at spotting this, so I'm just going to Control Z to get rid of those. Now, the first thing we're going to do is go to this menu here, brush settings. If you don't have this, you can go up to window and hit brush settings, and that will open this window on this toolbar here. So you should be faced with something like this. Now, if you're unfamiliar, this is your brush preview. This is what your brush currently looks like if you were to just click and hold and smear it in a line. That's what it would look like. But what we want to do is randomize this. So I'm going to hit Shape Dynamics, and on its own that won't do anything. But if I click on Shape Dynamics, we can see all these settings here. Now don't get put off. This will become a regular part of your map making as you get used to it. I've never not used this menu with any brush I use whenever I do maps. So what do we do with this? Well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to vary the size of the brush, but not too much. So I'm only going to send this up to about 50%. Now you can see there's sort of like this cloudy effect happening here a bit. Minimum diameter can stay where it is. Angle jitter, I'm going to put that to 100%, which, as you can see, completely rotates the brush every time you click. If I was to use this now, you can see we're getting some variety. Just undo that. Now I'm going to click Flip X jitter and Flip Y jitter, and that will just further randomize how we're painting. So I'm going to close this window because we don't need this anymore. We need to do a few more things before we can start painting. First thing we're going to do is make sure that there's sort of a halo around the landmass where I can't apply texture, simply to make it look like the really shallow areas of shoreline. To do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll up here, and I'm going to Control click on the thumbnail of my land, which will select the shape of your land, as you can see. If I hit V on the keyboard just to show you the mouse tool, we've got this area selected. So what that would mean is, while we're still in this layer mask here, I can only apply the brush to areas that are selected. We want to do the opposite. I'm going to hit Control Shift I, which inverts the selection. So now we're only selecting the ocean, we're not selecting any of this. But still, we want a little bit of a shore. So I'm going to go up to Select, Modify, and Contract. And what this will do is it will shrink the selection based on whichever part of the map we're selecting. I'm going to shrink this by, say, 10 pixels. This will depend on how big your map is, but you can experiment with this. So if I hit 10, you can see now that we've got this sort of border around the landmass, and depending on the size of your actual document, 10 pixels might be a lot more or a lot less. You just have to experiment with it and note down your numbers. We want to sort of soften this line a bit, because what this is going to do is create a harsh border where we can't paint on, and then you're going to see a very stark line. What I'm going to do here is go back to Select, Modify, and go to Feather. And now what I usually do is I feather it the same amount that I contracted it. You can also do it a bit less if you want a bit of a harsher border. but I'm going to stick with 10. So click OK. And now this has feathered the selection. You won't see it that well with the marching ants, but it's done its job, trust me. We can actually get to painting. But before I commit to doing any textures, I can't work with these marching ants everywhere. And you're probably wondering, how do you work without that selection there? Because the whole point was to make that selection. Well, all we have to do is hit Control or Command H. And no, that hasn't deselected it, but what it has done is hidden the selection. So we still can't paint in the landmass or the border we've made, but we just don't see the marching ants anymore. And if you want to bring them back, you simply press Control or Command H. There we go. I'm going to hit B for my brush. Then we're going to go up to flow here. And what flow does is it changes, it's similar to opacity, it changes how densely the brush you've selected works. And what I usually do for the start of this process is set this right down about 1 or 2%. Now that we've got this, we can actually start working. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag this to the center of my screen a bit. And I'm just going to start texturing. Now, you should be able to see there's this very slight deformation on the shelf here. And it's only slight, and this is what we want. We only want a slight texture, because this isn't completely flat. As we know, this has varying weights, and if we zoom in, there you go, you can really see it now. And you can sort of see there's a bit of a harsh edge here. This is due to our feathering settings, and we can play with that a bit more to make it a bit more refined. But as you can see, there's a nice texture there. So I'm going to zoom back out. About there's fine. We could stop there if you're happy with how that looks, or the texture anyway, but what I'm going to do is go a step further and do a few more brushes. So I'm going to go back to my brush settings, go to brush tip shape, and this will be a smaller preview of all your brushes. And I'm just going to select another brush. Again, you can use any texture brush you own. This doesn't have to just be for mapping. You could use grunge textures, concrete textures, anything that you've downloaded from anywhere, anything you've purchased or got for free. There's some brushes that I have which I downloaded for free from other artists. I'll see if I can get the links in the description for them. But this one I made is actually sampled from, I believe, Ice Cap. I'm not sure. I can't remember where it came from. But anyway, it's over 4,000 pixels wide, so this is a big brush. But you know, that's to my benefit, because then I don't have to blow it up and get any pixelation. So what I'm going to do is just minimize this menu again, and all the brush settings I just applied to the last brush stay with this one. And it's important to note that make sure you don't right click and choose another brush, because that will reset your brush settings and then you'll have to do all this again. So go to this menu and select from here, because these settings will apply to anything you click. So I'm just going to go through and do some more texturing. Just like that. And while you might not notice much of a difference, it is slowly building to a much greater design. And you might be able to see, if I hit V just to get rid of that brush, you might be able to see a slight halo around the actual shoreline. And this we can exaggerate a little bit better later on. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to a much harsher process of sort of bringing the height down in this bay area, because I want there to be some suggestion of, you know, almost a glacial slide down into the depths of the ocean. Whereas here we'll focus on more harsh cliffs. So I'm going to go back to my brush settings. Be a good idea to select brush first. There we go, B on the keyboard. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to scroll down my map brushes that I've put together. What I want is something like a cloud. I'm going to go for a cloud this time. Now there's a reason for this, because this has certain properties that I want to abuse. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the flow up to maybe 20%, probably no more than that. I'm just going to see what this looks like. Okay, so now you can see we're really getting a much harsher effect here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo that, maybe bring the flow back down to 15, maybe 12%. And I'm going to start digging in from around this area, and I'm going to, you know, sort of aim around here. Just click a few times in the area I want this effect to happen. Maybe there, just have it sort of feather out. Okay. And now we've got a bit of a sort of dip here, but this is a bit too cloudy for me, so I'm going to go in and let's see, I can use maybe this brush here. This is entirely up to you. This is a very sort of modular technique. You can use whatever you want. I'm just going to shrink the brush a bit with the left square bracket. I'm just going to dig this out a bit more. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change our selection because I want the next part to affect much less and have much more of a feathered edge. So I'm going to hit Control H or Command H to bring up the selection, then Control or Command D to deselect that. Now I'm going to go back up to my land layer, Control or Command click that layer again to reset our selection. And instead of inverting straight away, what you can do is go up to Select, Modify, Expand, and we do it this way instead, so we're doing the reverse. I'm going to expand by, let's say, 50 this time. And again, this will depend on your system. This is much bigger. So what we need to do now is feather this even larger. This goes up to 50 as well. It's just my preference. There you go, you can see better how this feather works now. It's much softer. Now I'm going to hit Control or Command Shift I to invert that selection, and then Control or Command H to hide it. Now, what I'm going to do here is something a bit more harsh. I'm going to select one of my other brushes here. I'm going to select this brush. This is one I downloaded for free from some... I cannot remember the name off the top of my head, but I promise you future me will put this in the description. And this has sort of a nice flow to it. So if I start painting with that, I'll turn the flow up to 100 just so you can see. If you look at that, it's just a wonderful sort of flow texture. So I'm going to use this quite a lot here. I'm going to turn the flow back down to maybe 50, 55%. And I'm just going to start painting this. And as you'll notice, it fades out where we feathered it. And it doesn't really affect the land too much. And this is really nice because it sort of gives us the illusion of sort of channels of water building up down here and sort of flowing into the ocean. Make sure we don't neglect this area either. So you'll want to do this all the way around your map as you go, but it does take a long time, but the result is so worth it. Okay, right, now that we're at this stage, what I often find is got to this point and it suddenly looks a bit too much. So what I tend to do is I just bring up the selection again, so Control or Command H, Control or Command D to deselect it. And now I want to sort of maybe bring more of the shallow areas back, because this is just looks a bit too intense in places. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I've got the shelf selected, the mask, and I'm going to hit Control or Command L. That brings up our levels. So this you'd normally use for contrast or boosting highlights or shadows on photos, but in this case this is only affecting the mask, which is why there's not much going on the histogram here. There's just a small bit of white over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just gently, matter of fact, I'm going to bring the midtones and I'm going to drag them slowly left and just see where we want to sort of leave it. So this will be entirely up to you. If we drag the midtones left, it brightens them. So I'm going to do that. And I'm happy with that for now. So I'm just going to click OK. And now we've got this nice sort of rugged texture, but it's not overbearing. Now then, we need to do the edges. First of all, I'm going to work on the really harsh cliff. I'm going to zoom in to 100%, and if you don't know how to do that, it's just Control or Command 1. Now you can really see the detail we've got here, so you can always go back and soften this up if you want to later. But we're going to focus on the edges now. So I'm going to move up to this area. Now, the brush I'm going to use for this is one I've titled OG Mount, I believe. OG Mount, there we go. So, still the same brush settings. I don't want it to be this big though. I'm going to drag this down to maybe 150. That'll do for now. And this is where we do the really, really harsh edge. So, I'm going to put my flow up to 100%. And now we just sort of go halfway over and you'll see the magic happen. So we're just going to paint black like that, and now you can see. So I'm just going to sort of follow this line just with the way the brush, well. So the world just ended apparently, and Photoshop crashed. Anyway, back to that. So make sure we're zoomed in to 100%. Just going to go through and chop up the edges here. So let the brush sort of guide your hand. It's going to sort of vary where I click here. And as you go along, you'll sort of get this idea of this sudden drop off that you see in those pictures and videos that freak everyone the hell out. I'm just going to go do this for a bit. Okay, and when you're done, you might notice sort of this almost visible line right at the base of these cliffs now. And this is just simply where your shelf originally bordered, but you've sort of chopped it up. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to shrink my brush right down. And I'm just going to sort of click and drag along that line. Just go nice and slowly. They don't make any huge changes. And I'm just going to sort of erase that really harsh line. And all the while still working in the layer mask. Make sure you're not just smearing paint on your nice blue layer. Okay, and we've got this nice cliff now. There are going to be areas like this where things don't make sense, and you can, you can bring your brush back up and chop it up even more, just to get rid of those sort of craters that these brushes inevitably create. And you can use any brush for the cliffs. I use these height map brushes that I've created over time, and they sort of do most of the work for me. So for instance, I could use, we go to the map pack, let's see, here we go. So for instance, I could use this one, which is a much bigger mountain range, and I could click here and we get some nice variety. And I'm going to just do this in a few places just to make sure it doesn't look so uniform. And just remembering to keep away from the extremes of your land masses. So you don't want anything to sort of cut too deep into the shoreline. Only because you wouldn't have just land floating over the abyss. There would be at least some sort of harsh cliff. Awesome. So once you're happy with that, we can now use these mountain brushes. Just to sort of vary the bay area here, because it's still, even though we went back and brightened it up, it's still a bit too flat for my liking. So I've just gone back and changed the flow to about 20%, and I'm just going to use this brush that I've got selected, start chopping up the bay. And you can be as extreme or as soft with this as you like. There's no real rule. It's I guess it's just the rule of cool at this point. This is all optional stuff. Okay, Alright, I think I'm happy with that. So, what else can we do to make this a little bit more realistic? Well, we've got this harsh drop-off, but we've got no real sort of gradients into the ocean floor, because it wouldn't just stop and then be flat for miles. So what I like to do at this point is, where I've got the really harsh drops here, I like to load just some texture brushes that I've maybe used before. I'm going to use this one, for instance. That's a bit too big at the moment. There we go. I'm going to bring my flow right down again, maybe around 5%. And this time I'm going to hit X on the keyboard to invert the colour we're painting with. So I want white. So that's now my foreground colour. And if we alt click on the layer mask here, we can actually see what we've done. So this is what it looks like raw. So now I'm going to be painting things back. So just click back on your layer and then click on the shelf again. Alternatively, you can just alt click the mask to come back to this view. And now I'm going to be painting white. And though you might not see much happening, which is true, you can't see much happening, I'm going to bring the flow back up to 20%, thereabouts. And then I'm going to paint sort of around the border here. And now you might see we're getting some texture on the floor near where the cliff edge is. And then I'm just going to change to another brush, making sure that I'm using this menu, this brush settings menu, to select my brush so the settings stay the same. It's varying the sizes of brushes. And again, you can use any brushes you've downloaded. You'll be surprised what different textures work for this kind of thing. This is just a result of me experimenting over time. I'm just going to make it a bit more thick over here where the gradient needs to be smoother into the ocean. Here I'll just place a bit of texture. And again, we'll just ignore this area, pretend that that's done, and it looks great. Maybe I will use one of these brushes. This is something I used earlier. Again, I'll try and find the link to these brushes because they're wonderful. These are a bit less obvious, so I'm going to turn my flow up to maybe 60% for these. And you should be able to see there's sort of this like flow dynamic we've got going on here, where maybe the over time channels have the currents have sort of flown down and into the ocean floor, and they've created these trenches and ridges, which is, you know, quite realistic. There we go. I'm just going to close this menu and zoom out just a bit so we can see what we've done so far. So looking at that, we've got a really nice continental shelf, and you can go around your entire continents to get this effect. And once you've done that, basically it's just about adding effects on top, sort of, you know, maybe painting brighter colours around your coastlines. And eventually you'll get a really nice backdrop for your land. And what this should look like afterwards is something like this. So this is what I've done after a long time of going around the entire continent. And obviously you do this in small steps. You take your time. Making a good effect like this does not happen quickly. You do need to just be patient with it and put a lot of love and care into it. And as you can see, we've done this same effect all the way around, even on your islands as well. Make sure they're not sitting on like a flat plate. You want to give some texture and depth between your islands. We zoom out back to the full document, which is Control or Command 0. Obviously we've got a grey boring landmass because I haven't done this yet, but now you can see the effect it's given here. And this is included with several adjustments I've made to the shorelines. I've added some variety of colours, some sort of cloudy effects around certain bay areas, and it's all about lots of small adjustments to make one huge effect, rather than just a quick and easy press of a button, which will, sometimes that can do the job enough if you're not really that interested, but this can really add another level to your map making, and yeah, it's a lot of fun when you get really into it. I find it very therapeutic. And yeah, so this is a full Continental shelf. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you've learned something. If you need any help, just send me a message, send me an email at joshuagolfervisual@outlook.com. I'm happy to help with anything. We're all creatives. We need to help each other out. Let's boost the creativity in this world and the non-existent worlds we're making. Okay, guys, thank you so much for coming. See you later.